Welcome. This video is a tutorial for assembling the MiSTerAddons MiSTercade JAMMA hat, basically connecting it to the DE10 Nano FPGA main board and getting it set up and configured with the MiSTer software and the necessary configuration files to make the MiSTercade work. The whole idea behind the MiSTercade is to make it really easy to plug and play a MiSTer FPGA retro gaming platform into a arcade cabinet that uses the JAMMA standard, which was typical for pretty much all arcade cabinets from the mid-80s up through the early 2000s. I'll start by reviewing each of the dip switch and slider switch settings that are on the MiSTercade hat itself, and talk about real quick what settings you need to worry about setting for different types of arcade cabinets, and then we'll go through the assembly procedure of attaching it to the DE10 Nano and getting the software set up. This tutorial is going to be following the MiSTercade Quick Start instructions. I'll have a link to them in the show notes below. I'll also have a link in the show notes to the full-blown MiSTercade manual, which has very in-depth step-by-step assembly instructions along with troubleshooting information and a lot more details. So if there's anything you need to know, or if you need to do some troubleshooting for things that I don't talk about in this video, definitely check the manual. And the manual also has some links on where you can reach out for additional help if you need it. So let's get started. So the most important connector on the MiSTercade, of course, is the JAMMA connector here. The JAMMA standard for arcade cabinets uses this standard connector for pretty much all JAMMA arcade games from the mid-80s up through the early 2000s. The JAMMA standard, basically through this port, provides the voltage to supply the board. It provides the RGB video signals. It provides a mono audio, single channel audio, analog. It wasn't until Street Fighter II came along in the early 90s that the JAMMA standard needed to accommodate more than 3 action buttons, and that's when Capcom introduced the CPS-1 and the CPS-2 custom connectors that would add, these were so-called kick harness connectors, because if these weren't connected, you would only get the 3 punch buttons in Street Fighter II. You would have to connect an additional kick harness for the 3 additional kick buttons to get that functionality. To accommodate that with an arcade cabinet, the MiSTercade has the connectors obviously for either CPS-1 or CPS-2, and so when you're plugging it into a compatible cabinet, there'll be a CPS-2 harness connector typically going to the extra buttons on the cabinet that you would plug in here. There's also a switch right here called JAMMA, which is kind of the slang term for Chinese JAMMA. Essentially, some of the Chinese clone cabinets that came along later on, I say clone because usually they're clones of popular candy cabinets like the Taito Ulixes. Anyway, the Chinese clone cabinets would use some of the extra ground lines from the JAMMA connector to hook up additional action buttons rather than using the Capcom CPS-1 and CPS-2 kick harness standard. So if you're going to connect MiSTercade into one of those JAMMA cabinets, rather than using the CPS kick harness buttons to get your extra buttons, you can go ahead and move the switch to on, and then you'll get those extra buttons. Okay, I've rotated the board so we can read the labeling for these jumpers more easily. This STM32DFU jumper is used for firmware updates on the board. If you need to update the firmware for the MiSTercade at some later date, you would just connect this jumper across the pins and follow the firmware update procedure in the manual. This next jumper right next to it has a setting for either P2, B8, or CC. Basically, some of the line signals on the JAMMA connector are used by default for coin counters on arcade cabinets. That means that the cabinet would have a physical counter to count how many quarters were inserted into the machine, and the arcade operator would keep a running tally, and that way they could check and see how much money the cabinet collected on any given day. If this jumper is set to the default of CC, then when a coin is input into the cabinet or a coin input signal is received through the JAMMA connector, then this will map that to the arcade core if the arcade core has correctly implemented the coin counting functionality, and it will increment the coin counter on the cabinet. It sends the signal to the cabinet to increment the physical coin counter. If you move the jumper over to P2, B8, that enables the coin counter circuits to act as player 2 mappings for button 7 and button 8. In other words, you can map additional buttons if your cabinet supports it. That could be useful for later on down the road if the Saturn core or the PlayStation core comes out, because those cores would require additional buttons beyond the 6 buttons that the kick harness provides. Moving on, we have 4 dip switches right here. The first dip switch, amp standby. If that dip switch is set to on, then the built-in mono analog amplifier, which outputs a mono audio signal through the JAMMA connector, will be disabled, and only line-level analog audio will be output through the RCA ports. Oh, and it will also output analog stereo audio through the 3.5mm headphone jack as well. If this switch is set to the default of off, then the onboard amplifier stays on and mono amplified audio will be output through the JAMMA connector. The second dip switch down, C1 equals C2, has to do with the coin counters again. For cabinets that only have one coin counter, then leaving this off, which is the default, getting a coin input into either the first coin chute or the second coin chute will increment the same coin counter output. If you set this to on, it separates the coin counter outputs for cabinets that actually have separate counters for player 1 versus player 2. The third dip switch we got down is P1 free, and underneath it we also have P2 free. That's free play mode. If either of these are set to on for that player, when you push the start button on the cabinet, it inputs a coin and then sends a start signal in one action, so you don't have to worry about coining up separately. Right here we have the 3 standard MiSTer push buttons, the top one being reset, the middle one being user, and the bottom one being OSD, or for on-screen display. Bottom button's probably the one you use the most. That's the one you use for pulling up the MiSTer's menu for changing cores, changing games, configuring options, etc. The MiSTercade also lets you push down and start by default to also trigger that menu button. You can disable that if you want this to act more like a standalone cabinet and not allow people to get into the menu without actually opening up the cabinet and pushing the physical button. The middle user button is sometimes used for skipping through menus, like if there's a button you don't want to map, you can push user to skip that mapping and move on. And the top reset button will reset the MiSTer. Right here we have the volume dial for the mono single channel amplified audio that outputs to the JAMMA connector. Next to it we have the switch for audio routing. On the default local, this volume dial is what controls the volume that goes out to the cabinet. If you plug in the optional MiSTercade remote, you can slide this switch over to remote, and then the volume control will be handled through the remote board rather than here on the main board. Moving a little more over to the right, there's a fan jumper right here. MiSTercade already comes with an onboard fan, but if you decided you wanted to swap that onboard fan out for something else, you might need to change the amount of voltage the fan gets. On the bottom setting, the 3V3, the fan gets 3.3 volts of power. If you move this jumper up to 5V, then the fan gets 5 volts of power. The jumper right above it is for the VGA port. You can set whether you want that port to use TTL C-Sync, which is typical for VGA PC computer monitors, or the 75 ohm C-Sync, which is used for component cables, SCART cables, aftermarket DACs that connect using the VGA pinout but don't follow the VGA standard for sync signals. Finally, these pin headers here are for connecting accessories such as the announced MiSTercade remote board. The remote board basically lets you run a remote module away from the MiSTercade board, so you can run it outside the cabinet and have an easy place to access the MiSTer buttons and adjust volume in addition to other functionality. So the MiSTer hat, the remote hat, if you bought it, would connect here, and there might be some other accessories coming down the road that would use these pin headers as well. All right, let's go around the outside of the MiSTerCade board and see what connections we have. Right here we have 4 standard USB ports. Those can be used for any USB accessories that you would plug into MiSTerCade, such as a Wi-Fi adapter, Bluetooth adapter, portable hard drive, flash drive, USB keyboard, mouse, etc. Right here, this is a micro USB connection for connecting a bridge board down to the DE10 Nano. You'll see whether that's used when we assemble this to the DE10 Nano baseboard. Rotating this way, we've got another 2 USB ports right here, again for any standard accessory use. Okay, over here on the far side of the board, this is the user I/O port. It looks like it uses the standard USB pin out, but USB devices won't work if you plug into it. Instead, this is where you would plug in so-called SNAC accessories. Serial Native Accessory Connection, I believe is what SNAC stands for. SNAC are zero latency devices such as light guns, where you can plug in like a Nest Zapper light gun or a Super Scope into this port using a cable, and it will work. Next to it here is a VGA port for connecting, well, in the case of MiSTerCade, there are some cabinets that use a 24 kilohertz or 32 kilohertz screen, and in which case those cabinets will have a VGA connector that you can plug in here. For pretty much everything else, though, you're going to want to use the JAMMA connector down the other end for traditional 15 kilohertz JAMMA standard video. Let's talk briefly about how the JAMMA standard handles audio. The JAMMA standard calls for a single mono amplified signal to be sent from the arcade board. So every JAMMA arcade board has its own onboard amplifier with its own volume knob, where adjusting that volume knob drives an amplifier that sends a signal directly to a speaker. So the speaker is essentially connected directly onto the arcade board with no other amplifier in the way. To follow that standard, the MiSTerCade has an onboard amplifier with the heatsink on it here, and then this volume dial will adjust the volume level for that single channel mono audio that goes out to it. As arcade hardware advanced, some developers such as Capcom would add amplifiers into the cabinets that would accept stereo audio, but they would expect those stereo signals to come out of the arcade board at line level, that is non-amplified levels, and then the amplifier on the cabinet would take care of amplifying that line level signal. So again, to accommodate that later standard, the MiSTerCade has both RCA ports and a 3.5mm headphone jack here. So if your cabinet is equipped with an amplifier, then you would connect to these ports, in which case you wouldn't use this volume dial to adjust the volume, you would use the volume dial on the cabinet's amplifier to adjust the output volume. All right, now that we've reviewed the MiSTerCade's functions and features, let's move on to the procedure for connecting it to the DE10 Nano. So the DE10 Nano here is the heart and soul of the MiSTer. It's got the FPGA core right here, which makes the magic happen, and then the MiSTerCade hat will be attaching to these accessory pins on top here. So the first step is to use a regular Phillips head screwdriver and just remove these 4 screws. We won't be keeping this transparent plastic faceplate, but we will be keeping the screws. All right, now that faceplate's out of the way, there's 2 things we need to take care of. The MiSTerCade comes with a heatsink that you will want to peel the protective tape off the bottom, and then you're going to want to stick it onto the FPGA core, making sure that you completely cover the core. So just like that. Just press it into place. And then there are 4 setting switches down here at the bottom. This last switch, if you're going to be using analog audio for your JAMMA cabinet, which is going to be most people, whether that's the single channel JAMMA audio that goes through the JAMMA connector, or if you're going to be using stereo analog audio through the RCA jacks or the headphone jack, then you're going to want to move this last switch up, just like that. The only time you leave this down is if you're going to use the digital Toslink audio. Alright, now that the DE10 faceplate is removed and the heatsink is applied and the switch is set, we're ready to attach the MiSTercade hat. The cooling fan on the MiSTercade will be sitting over the top of the heatsink on the DE10 Nano. You want to make sure that they are aligned in such a way that the MiSTercade text here at the bottom is readable and the Terasic logo is here, right here in the DE10 Nano labeling is readable. You don't want either of these upside down in relation to each other. Alright, so I'm going to flip these over. And so you want this double pin header here to line up and drop into the double pin header on the MiSTercade hat here, just like that. See, I've got it lined up with no extra pins sticking out of the sides. And if we turn it around, you'll see on the other side that this row of pins right here is lining up with the holes inside the DE10 Nano right there. And likewise, the screw holes will also line up between the MiSTercade hat and the mounts on the DE10 Nano. So once you've got everything lined up, like I do here, flip it back one more time so you can see that double pin header. So once you got everything lined up with no pins sticking out any of the edges, go ahead and just press it together with your thumbs. So that side's pressed together and this side's pressed together. And now that the hat and DE10 Nano are attached together, you'll note that the 2 corner mounting holes line up with the mounts underneath, and likewise for this middle set of holes here. So we're going to take the 4 screws that we saved from removing the clear plastic plate earlier and install those into those 4 screw holes to keep the MiSTercade hat attached to the DE10 Nano. There we go, all 4 Phillips head screws are now tightened down firmly. Alright, the next step is to install the micro USB bridge. If we rotate this counterclockwise, you'll see that there is a micro USB here on the MiSTercade hat and a micro USB port right here on the DE10 Nano. The MiSTercade comes with a little bridge board that, whoops, dropped it, that will install to connect those 2 together. Just like that. So the last step of assembly we're going to cover is this double pin header right here, which is used to connect SD RAM. The DE10 Nano has DDR memory, which a few of the arcade cores and console cores can use, but if you want complete functionality, have access to all the games and all the cores, you're going to want to obtain one of these add-on SD-RAM modules. And you'll notice that, so the chips are on this side, but the labeling says this side faces outward. So you want to make sure that labeling is facing away from the center of the board, and you'll just line up the pin header such that all the pins line up and none of the pins are sticking out to the sides, and then just press it down into place, just like that. And as far as hardware setup is concerned, that's it for the MiSTercade. Next, we'll move on to the setup and configuration. Alright, to get the MiSTer set up with the operating system software and games, we're going to have to temporarily connect some modern equipment, specifically an HDMI display of some type, like the computer monitor I've got here, the AC adapter, power adapter that comes with the DE10 Nano, a USB keyboard. You'll need to use a computer, doesn't matter if it's Windows, Mac, or Linux, just any regular computer. MicroSD card reader and that you'll connect to your computer. And then you'll need an internet connection. You can either connect an Ethernet cable to the port here, or you can use a MiSTer compatible Wi-Fi USB adapter like the one I'm going to use in this example right here. So to start, go ahead and just plug in the USB accessories like the Wi-Fi adapter and the keyboard, if I can get the cable here, into any of the USB ports on the MiSTerCade hat. Just don't use that special user I/O port here on the back. That's for snack accessories and doesn't work for regular USB devices. The HDMI cable for your monitor, you want to connect that to the HDMI port, if I can find it here, on the bottom side of the DE10 Nano right here, and you'll see there's also a port right there for the AC adapter. Alright, there we go. So I've connected the AC adapter into the barrel plug right there. And then you're going to take your microSD card. The DE10 Nano ships with one right here that you can use. It's only 8 gig though, so if you're planning on loading on a lot of games, you might want to get a larger microSD card or plan on connecting a USB storage device into one of the USB ports. I'll go ahead and use this card for the example. And I'm going to plug this microSD card into the card reader and then connect that to the laptop, and we'll pick things up over there. Alright, here we are on my Windows laptop, and I have the quick start guide pulled up right now that we've been stepping through. We already went through part 1 where we physically attached the MiSTerCade PCB to the DE10 Nano, and now we're stepping through part 2 where we set up the software for the microSD card. So let's step through the intermediate steps for part 2. Connect the DE10 Nano to an HDMI TV or monitor, that's done. Connect a keyboard to a USB port on the MiSTerCade, that's done. Connect an Ethernet cable or a MiSTer compatible Wi-Fi USB adapter, that's done. And now it's going to send us to this website for MiSTer Fusion and follow the instructions there to prepare the microSD card. So I'm going to click on that link and it's going to open a new tab. And on this page we just need to skip past that introductory text, and step 1 says to download the latest version from the releases page, so we'll go there. And then I will download the MiSTer Fusion 2.3 image. And we'll save that. And then I'll go back. And click back again. There we go. And for step 2, we need to install a flash utility that will write the MiSTer Fusion image to the card. And in my own personal experience, Balana Etcher works the best for Windows. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that to download it. And then we'll download it for Windows. It's thinking about it. There we go, and I'll save it. Alright. And once Balana finishes downloading, let's go ahead and install it first. Still thinking about it. Come on. Alright, I accept licensing agreement. It installs. And there it is. So now it's waiting for us to give it a file. So now I'll go back to my downloads folder and I'll open the MiSTer Fusion zip file that was downloaded. And I'm just going to close the WinRAR warning, and I will extract that file to my downloads folder. So now I can go back to Balana Etcher. I'm going to say I'm going to flash from a file, and then in my downloads folder, there's the MiSTer Fusion 2.3 image I just extracted. So I select that. Alright, so I'm going to plug in my MicroSD card reader. There we go. And Windows will pop up a bunch of messages saying that it needs to be formatted. You can just go ahead and hit cancel and OK on any messages related to that. Close that window, cancel that window, OK, cancel. Okay, so we're back at Balana Etcher. We've selected the MiSTer Fusion image. We're going to select our target, and we're going to choose my MicroSD card. Select, and then I'll say flash. And it will take, okay, then we got to confirm we want to allow it to do it. And this will take probably a minute or so to write the card. Okay, so once it finishes writing the image, we once again get these format warnings from Windows that you'll want to just cancel and dismiss. Cancel. And we see Balana Etcher reports the flash was complete. So we can go ahead and close that out. And now I'm going to unplug the MicroSD reader from Windows, and we'll switch back over to the MiSTer. Alright, here we are back at the MiSTercade, and I just finished using Balana Etcher to write the MiSTer Fusion image. So I'm going to install the MicroSD card back into the DE10 Nano, and then we'll plug the power cord in. And now if we watch the monitor, you can see that it's getting things set up. So we just need to wait for that to finish. Notice that it says the system will automatically restart when done. Alright, looks like it's restarting now. And here we are at the MiSTer opening screen where it tells us there are no files. So now we'll go ahead and unplug the power again and take out the MicroSD card, and we're going to move it back over to the computer again to copy more files. Alright, we're back here on the Windows computer, and we just finished the last step of part 2. Once the MiSTer menu appears, you're ready to proceed. Unplug the DE10 Nano power cable, remove the MicroSD card, and move it back to your PC. So I'm going to plug that card into my card reader right now. And again, you'll get some annoying Windows prompts. Just hit cancel and OK to anything that pops up. OK. Cancel. OK. But now if I go to Windows Explorer and go to this PC, we see that now there's a MiSTer data volume available, and that is where we're going to be copying all of our files from this point forward. Back to the instructions. We're starting part 3. We're going to install the MiSTercade scripts, binding files, and game ROMs on the MicroSD card. First step, we're going to go to this GitHub site to download the update all sh file. So follow that link, scroll down. The update all is an all-in-one script for keeping not just the main MiSTer framework, but a whole bunch of cores and other things up to date on the MiSTer for you. So it'll take care of running the main MiSTer updater to keep the framework up to date. It will get the latest Stratego cores, the unofficial cores, the LLAPI cores. It will download BIOS files for any consoles or arcade systems that need them. It will take care of getting MAME ROMs. It will take care of updating name files and arcade core files. It will rename things so that things are organized and easy to find. All in all, very useful script to have, and I recommend running it frequently to keep your MiSTer up to date. To set it up, we just need to download a zip file, and we're going to extract the update all sh file to the scripts folder on the primary SD card. So let's do that. We'll download the zip file, save it, open it from my downloads folder, and then I'm going to close WinRAR prompt. There we go, and then we're going to extract it to the MiSTer data drive in the scripts subfolder. Just like that. Close this out. Back to the instructions. Now we're going to remove the MicroSD card from the card reader again and move it back to the MiSTercade so that we can execute the update all script over there. So we'll see you back at the MiSTer. Alright, we're back here at the MiSTer. I just finished extracting the update all script file to my microSD card. So we'll put it back into the DE10 Nano and we'll plug the power back in. And the MiSTer does not take long to start up at all. There it is. And when it says no files, it's really just saying there aren't any core files, but running the update all script now will take care of that. So on your USB keyboard, you're going to hit the F12 key to pull up the menu. We're going to go down to scripts. And it warns you that scripts can sometimes be dangerous, so be careful of the scripts that you want to run. I'm going to go ahead and say yes and don't ask me again. And if you're using an Ethernet connection, you can go ahead and just run the update all script right now. In my case, I'm going to use a Wi-Fi connection, and you may recall that earlier I plugged in a MiSTer compatible Wi-Fi dongle, so I'm going to configure my Wi-Fi right now. I'll go to Wi-Fi, and it's going to search, and my Wi-Fi access point is Cat Haven, because I have too many stray cats. Enter my Wi-Fi password. And after a moment, it will reboot. Let's see, looks like actually you can't see that prompt, but we're getting told to press any key to continue. So I'll hit a key and we're back to the MiSTer menu again. This is not focusing. There we go. Okay, and the Wi-Fi icon right there shows that we have an internet connection now. Now we have an internet connection, we're ready to run the update script. So again, we'll go to scripts, I'll go to update all, and it tells us what sequence it's going to run. We can wait out the 15 seconds or just press down to continue now, so I'll hit down, and we're going to wait for this to finish. Since this is the first time I've run it, it's going to take a long time to run because it has to pull down every core. When you run it after the first time, it will only have to download what changes, so it won't take as long. So I'll go ahead and pause the video now and we'll pick things up after this is done. Alright, the update all script finished running, so I'm going to press the key to continue, and we'll see we're back to the MiSTer menu. And now if we go back into the scripts folder, we're going to want to run one more script. I'll arrow up here and highlight fast USB pulling on. What this does is that USB ports are normally pulled for control inputs every 15 milliseconds, but the MiSTercade control interface supports 1 millisecond pulling. So we're going to run the fast USB pulling to lower the pulling rate from 15 down to 1. Oh, let's sit too long. Okay, F12, and we'll execute that. And with some game controllers, this can cause a problem, but the MiSTercade is designed for it. So if you were using another MiSTer and had other controllers plugged in that didn't like this, you could go back into the scripts menu again and turn the fast USB pulling off. Okay. So now the other thing the update all scripted for us is that it loaded on arcade cores, including pulling down the MAME files. So that means I could select like Black Tiger here, and there it goes. So we are almost ready. We just need to unplug this, and we're going to move it one more time. We're going to move the MicroSD card one more time over to the Windows laptop so we can copy some MiSTercade configuration files and also load on any additional ROMs that we need. Alright, here we are back at the computer for the last time. We just finished executing the update all script and the fast USB polling script. So now on the instructions, our next step is going to be to go to the MiSTercade website, and on the website we'll be clicking on the green code button and downloading the zip file. So let's do that. I'll click on this link and click the green code button and say download zip, and we'll save it. And then I'm going to just extract that to the downloads folder. It's not going to go onto the card yet. So we're only going to grab some of the files from this. Okay, back to the instructions. Oh yeah, it says it right here. So after the zip file is finished downloading, extract the contents to a temporary folder. So that's done. Next, we're going to copy the extracted config folder to the root of the microSD card, overriding the existing config folder if prompted. So, here's the one we extracted, and there's the config folder. Oh, I didn't plug in the microSD card yet, so let me do that. Which means, again, we're going to get some Windows prompts that we can ignore. So cancel, OK, cancel, close. Okay, so we're in the downloads folder. We've got the MiSTercade main folder. There's a config subfolder in there, and I'm going to put that into the MiSTer data volume. And it's going to take a minute for all these files to copy. These are input mapping files. Normally, we would need to map each console core and arcade game core one by one for the MiSTercade controls. Oh, I'm going to replace the files. Okay. But MiSTerAddons already went and did all the work for us on mapping all of the cores. So by putting these files onto the card, basically every game will be mapped and ready to play as soon as it loads up without us needing to do anything ourselves to map it. Big time saver. Okay, now back to the instructions. Now, this step's interesting, so we're going to need to open the config folder, then the input subfolder on the microSD card. So I'm going to switch to the MiSTer data volume, and we're going to go to the config folder and the inputs folder. And in this list of files near the top, we'll see several zip files that start with _main _mapping. And what these are, we're going to select only one of these to be the key combo shortcut to push on the arcade joystick to pull up the MiSTer menu. So, for example, I like to use down and start, so I will open this zip file, and then I'm going to extract this map file back out to here, replacing the existing one. And now, when I push down and start on the arcade controls, that will pull up the MiSTer menu. And so we see we have options here. You can make button 1 and button 6 your combo for pulling up the menu, button 3 and button 5 for pulling up the menu, start and a coin input at the same time, down and coin, down and start, which I just did, or if you want to have complete lockout so the menu can't be pulled up except by getting into the cabinet and pushing the menu button on the MiSTercade itself, you can use the no menu file, but you do need to extract one of these mapping files out. Alright, so we'll close this WinRAR window, back to the instructions. Okay, next, if your cab has a 15 kHz display, rename the MiSTer 15 kHz INI file to MiSTer INI. Copy that file to the root of the microSD card, overwriting the existing file when prompted. If your cab has a 31 kHz display, which is driven by the VGA port, you're going to rename the MiSTer 31 kHz INI file to MiSTer INI and copy it to the root of the microSD card. So my cabinet, I actually have two cabinets I'm going to be demonstrating this with, but both of my cabinets are 15 kHz displays driven by the JAMMA harness. So go back to Windows Explorer, and then I'm going to go back to my Downloads folder, to the temporary files we extracted earlier, MiSTercade main, and then I need the 15 kHz INI file, so I'll rename this to just say MiSTer.ini, and I will copy this into the MiSTer data folder, like that. Alright, back to the instructions. Okay, next step. Copy game ROMs into the appropriate subfolders inside the games folder on the microSD card. So, if I go back to the MiSTer data volume, which is the microSD card, and then I go into the games subfolder, we see here a list of all of the console and home computer and handheld cores that the MiSTer has support for. And this is where you would copy any ROMs you have for that particular platform into the appropriate subfolders. So Neo Geo ROMs go into the Neo Geo folder, NES ROMs go into the NES folder, Super Nintendo ROMs go into the SNES folder, etc. I'm not going to tell you where to get ROMs, just know that if you search the internet, they're out there. I'm not going to copy any additional ROMs because the update all script already went ahead and grabbed some all the files for the arcade cores, and I'm just going to use those. So I'm not going to worry about adding any additional ROMs for this demonstration. Alright, and then finally, last step, remove the microSD card from the PC, install it back to the DE10 Nano, and then it's time to install the MiSTercade in your arcade cabinet. So we'll pick things up from my arcade cabinets downstairs. Alright. We're down in my basement now, and I have two cabinets that I'm going to demonstrate the MiSTercade with. This cabinet on the left is a US upright dynamo cabinet. That's a very common cabinet in the United States. Typically they came with monitors anywhere from 15 inches to 29 inches in size. This one used to be a Midway Mortal Kombat cabinet, and it's had a lot of work done. I put a new monitor into it. The control panel's been redone. New power supply, but this one's a pretty good test case for MiSTer because it's got a 6-button layout up here on the control panel, and then inside the drawer here I added a kick harness for those additional buttons, and it also has, well, these dynamo cabinets normally have mono audio, but I added an amplifier and RCA jacks to do stereo on this cabinet. The other cabinet we'll be trying this with is my Taito EGRAT2 candy cabinet from Japan. This one's set up to a vertical Tate configuration, so we'll be making a small change to the MiSTer INI file before starting this one up that I'll demonstrate. But this cabinet also has an amplifier, but we'll be using it in the JAMMA mode instead, so we can demonstrate both modes. All right, well, let's get things started with the dynamo cabinet. All right, here we are at the dynamo cabinet, and I've got the MiSTercade here ready to connect. Before I plug it in, let's talk power for just a moment. So here on the right, this is a typical arcade power supply. Arcade power supplies take AC input in and then put several different voltages out. The ones we care about are the 5 voltage supply rail and the 12 volt supply rail. The 5 volt rail is what normally runs the logic on the arcade game board that you plug in, and the 12 volt rail runs the mono sound amplifier circuit on the arcade board that you plug in. As I said before, the JAMMA standard has mono audio, and each arcade board is responsible for driving the speakers. So we need 12 volts and an amplifier circuit to run mono speakers typically. In the case of MiSTer, well, let me mention, so the power supply has a white adjustment dial here on the right. Again, that's very typical for JAMMA power supplies. That dial lets you adjust the output level of the 5-volt supply because JAMMA boards have a lot of variance in how much power they use. So some early giant boards, like from the early 80s, mid 80s, you know, you'd see these large 2 or 3 board stacks to make Capcom and IREM games work, and they would need a lot more power than the boards like the cave boards that came along in the early 2000s that were much smaller and much more integrated. So normally you would have a multimeter or a voltmeter connected, and when you connect a new board into the cabinet, you would want to adjust that adjustment dial to make sure that you were getting as close to 5 volts on the supply line as you could. Because if you don't want to send too much power and burn out the board, you don't want to undersupply it either, because that'll make it crash. Fortunately, with the MiSTercade, it's not a big deal, because the MiSTercade is set up to run all of the internal electronics and the USB accessories all through the 12-volt supply, which doesn't have any adjustments. So basically it's just a plug it in and run kind of thing. You don't have to worry about doing any voltage adjustments with the MiSTercade. The MiSTercade does put a small load on the 5-volt line just because some power supplies expect it. But otherwise, yeah, you don't have to worry about making any adjustments with MiSTercade. All right, so let's go ahead and connect things up here. So I've got my JAMMA harness here, which goes to the cabinet. Mine is keyed. There's a key here that matches up to the notch on the JAMMA connector of the MiSTercade, and that's to make sure that you don't end up inadvertently plugging the harness in upside down. Not all JAMMA harnesses have keys, so if yours doesn't have a key, you want to look for some kind of label that says this is the top side or the component side. I don't know if it's readable on camera, but mine says component. Oh, I've got upside down. Here we go, yeah. This side is labeled component right here, and then the opposite side says solder side, upside down right there. And so you want to make sure you have your component side face up when connecting it to your arcade board. If you plug the connector upside down, then bad things happen. So make sure you double check that. But okay, so we just plugged in the JAMMA harness securely. If you've got more than 3 or 4 action buttons, then you'll need to plug in a CPS 1 or 2 kick harness connector. This is a CPS 2 connector, so I'll plug that in there. And then if you're going to be using stereo sound through an amplifier, like I'm doing with this cab, then you can plug in your amplifier lines just like that. Mine uses RCAs. Some of them also just use a 3.5mm headphone jack right there. So, okay, that's all there is to it. So let's go ahead and shut the drawer. And I'll turn off the overhead light and we'll turn this on. Okay, I've turned off the overhead light so we don't have any glare. Turn the cabinet on. And it takes a minute for the screen to warm up, but there's our MiSTer opening screen. And as I said earlier, MiSTercade, if you follow the instructions, all the cores will already be mapped, so really at this point we can just select a game and go. So we'll go to the arcade cores, and let's try something that uses 6 buttons. So let's go to Street Fighter. Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition, sure. All right, there's the opening legal stuff. I'll go ahead and put in a coin. Hit start. All right. I'll just try out my buttons here. So we got left, right, down, up, light punch, medium punch, hard punch, and then light kick, medium kick, hard kick. So we're all good there. Let's test player 2, so I'll put in another quarter. Now on every core, the player 2 controls are mapped to match the first player controls. So if you do end up mapping any cores manually, you never have to worry about mapping player 2 separately. Just map one player and then that's it, you're good for both of them. Alright, same thing with player 2. Got my light punch, medium punch, hard punch, light kick, medium kick, hard kick. So yeah, this is all good to go. You can just play some games and enjoy it. Now you may remember earlier I set up the mapping file to have down and start to be the control shortcut for pulling up the menu, so I'll do that. Down and start, and there's the MiSTer menu. You can change the options for this particular game if you wanted to, or if I hit right arrow, I can go to core and pick a different game if I wanted. So let's do Strider. And after a moment, there is Strider. So yeah, it really is just that easy. Once you get it all configured, should be able to just plug in your JAMMA harness and play some games. Let's go ahead and go back to the Windows laptop for a moment, and I'll talk about the configuration file change we need to make to work with vertical cabinets like my egret. Alright, we're back on my laptop, and I just put the MicroSD card from the MiSTer back into the card reader, so I'm getting all the Windows prompts that we need to cancel. Looks like maybe that's the only one this time. Okay, so earlier I copied over a MiSTer file from the files we downloaded from the MiSTercade GitHub that was for the 15 kilohertz horizontal display that my Dynamo cab uses. Let's go back to my downloads folder again, and I'll go back to that MiSTercade main folder that has the files we extracted earlier. And you see there's also 15 kilohertz Tate counterclockwise, 15 kilohertz Tate clockwise, and then equivalents for the 31 kilohertz files. My egret2 is a 15 kilohertz display, so I won't be using the 31 kilohertz files. The display is rotated counterclockwise from the normal horizontal orientation. So that's the file we're going to use. I'm going to copy that over to the MiSTer, oh, come on Windows, I'll copy that over to my MicroSD card. And then the MiSTer file we had earlier for the horizontal layout, I'll just change that name to something else. I'll just call it Hori, MiSTer. And now we'll just rename this Tate counterclockwise file to just be MiSTer.ini. And that is the only change we need to make to be ready to plug the MiSTercade into the vertical cab. So I will eject the MicroSD card and we'll pick things up back over at the cabinet. Alright, here we are at my Taito egret cab. I've opened the access door at the bottom where the arcade boards normally go. I've also got cats trying to run past me, so I'm blocking them off here. Anyway, okay, so you see we've got our JAMMA harness here, and once again I'm going to connect that to my MiSTer. It has a sticker on the top labeled JAMMA, which in this case is the top side, and it's also keyed. So again, you just want to make sure your key matches up and plug that in, like so. This cabinet does not have 6 buttons wired up on it right now, so there's no CPS 1 or 2 kick harness connector to plug in. This cabinet does have an amplifier. You can see it down at the bottom there for stereo sound, but for demonstration purposes, I'm going to go ahead and use the mono audio this time, which means that the adjustment dial on top of the MiSTercade right here will be what adjusts the output going to the speakers. So actually, before we start, it's up at max right now, so I'll set it down just a little bit. All right. And the egret's power supply is right here for the arcade board, Again, there's a little blue adjustment pot at the bottom. I don't know if you can see it, but normally you adjust that pot for 5 volts on the board. Again, you don't have to worry about that with the MiSTerCade, so just plug it in and go. Over here on the right, there's an access door for selecting whether the amp runs in stereo mode through the amplifier or a mono mode where the speakers are driven by the board. So I'm going to go ahead and flip that over to mono. And then I'll just turn off the overhead lights and we'll power up. All right, lights are off, so I'll go ahead and turn the cabinet on. And again, it takes a minute to start up, but there's our MiSTer menu. And the different configuration file we loaded takes care of changing the orientation of the menu to match the monitor. So again, it's pretty much just ready to play. So we'll go to arcade, and let's see, a good vertical game. We can do Apache. And this is a large game, so it takes a minute to load. There goes Apache. Now this cabinet's set up to actually take coins, so I'll drop one in and start. Like I said, in this case, the sound is being driven by the volume dial. It's outputting amplified mono audio from the MiSTerCade, so turning this dial will make the game quieter or louder when you're using a mono sound for the JAMMA harness.
Okay. Countdown begins.
So I'll play this one-handed for just a moment so we can all, again, check the controls, make sure everything seems to work. We can bomb, we got rapid fire. And so, yeah, everything seems to be working the way that it should be. Well, that's pretty much everything there is to know about setting up and configuring a MiSTerCade. I hope everyone that has a MiSTerCade has a fun time with it, and we'll see you on the next video.